and Afia Farouk, clinical psychologist in training, in developing this Making Words Matter, along with Space and, of course, our own Steve Bagley, who has both have contributed to, or all four have contributed to making this document so valuable. Attending to language when working with children subject to the risk of exploitation, it highlights the importance of language that we use when safeguarding and responding to those complex issues of exploitation. And if I reflect back, when I started in this field of work in 1998, we referred to children as child prostitutes. So there is already a development around our language and the way we use language when working with these young people, but there's still so much more to do. There's been a whole range of work across the country that's around not using victim blaming language, and lots of local and national guidance being produced, appropriate language, child sexual and or criminal exploitation guidance for professionals by the Children's Society in 2018 is an example of that. And I also hear that adult services partnerships are beginning to develop guidance to support staff as well. It's so important to recognise this cliff edge of those reaching 18 and how we do support them into those adult services. It's been important work to undertake the dehumanization of language that's used in criminal exploitation, and hearing about the powerful presentations by both Romana at the House of Commons in working with parents as safeguarding partners has been really good. Our own NWG training lead, Sarah, who's on today, has developed a course around Mind Your Language, bringing to life some of those complexities, and it's been really popular and received a lot of really good feedback. And we were delighted when Afia and Romana agreed to collaborate with us and Space in developing this practice and knowledge briefing. We looked forward to hearing from you, though. This is the important bit for us. How are you going to implement this? What is the impact for you on that front line? And we look forward to hearing how you're going to use this document and what impact it has, what we need to amend in it, and what will the second version look like, because clearly this is just the start of this language. So a big thank you as well to all of those who offered their case studies to the briefing paper, and we'll hear from them today too. So, but for now, let's hear from Dr. Romana Farouk and Afia Farouk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sheila. I'm just going to try and share my slides for the presentation. So I'm hoping everyone can see that.
Yeah, we can see. Oh, yeah, there it is. If you just pop it on slideshow.
Brilliant.
Well done. Thank you.
Brilliant. Right. First of all, thank you so much to the NWG network for inviting myself and Afia to deliver this keynote presentation, and also for supporting the launch of the National Practice and Knowledge Briefing on attending to language when working with children and young people who are subject to exploitation. I'd also like to extend a massive thank you to the contributors. They are all in attendance today and will be presenting. And the key thing to say is all our presentations today are on a similar topic, but essentially we are speaking from different perspectives and different standpoints, whether that's based on our own personal experiences or based on the organisations within which we work. So essentially there'll be a key theme throughout the launch today, which is the importance of attending to language. For those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I'm Dr. Romana Farouk. I'm a principal clinical psychologist and clinical lead. I work in the NHS and I work into the children and young people secure estate. I am the principal investigator and also a co-author of the Practice of Knowledge Briefing, and I specialise in working with children and young people who are subject to human rights violations, exploitation, trafficking, and modern-day slavery. I've set up a number of services nationally around working with children who present with high risk, high harm, and high vulnerability. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm going to pass on to Afia, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Afia Apia and I'm a clinical psychologist in training, and my background is in specialist psychological services, working into children and young people's mental health services, substance misuse, and working into novel psychological intervention development, and also practice and knowledge briefing development. And I currently work into the Children's Secure Estate alongside Romana, and I'm lead author on the knowledge briefing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Afia. When myself and Afia got together to think about this keynote presentation around language, the first saying that came to mind was, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And I guess the reflection was, well, words can hurt, they can be painful, they can be damaging. So we wanted to give you today a psychosocial understanding of the impact of discourses and narratives on children subject to organised abuse and exploitation. But to begin, I wanted to ask you all the most important question in the world, which is, why is the child crying? And this is a question that was posed by Alice Walker. I love her work. I love her literature that she's written, but she asked the most important question in the world, which is, why is the child crying? And what I find really interesting about this question that she asked is that she did not ask what is wrong with the child. She didn't ask, why is the child unsettled? She didn't ask, why is the child displaying aggressive behavior? She asked, why is the child crying? And actually, by the language that Alice Walker used, she elicited an affectionate. So this language about asking, why is the child crying, evoked an affectionate, caring, and a curiosity within us as practitioners. So you begin to wonder what is actually going on with the child. And I think that's a really important question to ask when you're working with children who are subject to exploitation, and to kind of really change the focus of the work that we do. But essentially, what I think is really important to state here is that language, it's a very powerful tool. So language can be used to inspire, it can be used to empower, it can be used to encourage. Language is so powerful that it can be used to evoke hope, resilience, dreams, or aspirations in our children and young people. The language can help children and young people understand what's going on for them internally. It can help them make sense of their identity, their place in the world, and it can help them make sense of the relationships that they are in. But language can also oppress. It can silence, it can criticize, it can shame, and it can blame. And I think that's really important for us to think about and explore as practitioners and as organisations. That often in our practice and within our services, do we use language that inspires, encourages, or empowers, or do we use language that might inadvertently oppress, silence, criticise, blame, or shame our children and young people? And we present this in a way to evoke some reflection, and perhaps some critical reflection on ourselves, but also the services in which we might work.
So essentially what Romana was describing was the power of language to dehumanize, and this is named the psychological dehumanization. And what this does is it helps us to treat others as less than human and deny them their full humanity or their full humanness. But what this also allows us to do is to not acknowledge the cruelty and suffering groups of people can be subject to as a result of psychological dehumanization. And also what we need to keep in mind is the ramifications dehumanization has on us psychologically and also on public policy. So psychological dehumanization comprises of the categorization of people, the objectification of people, the use of negative imagery and metaphors about groups of people. And I could give an example of this. So, for example, the sexualization of women and the negative discourses about immigrants or people living in poverty. What psychological dehumanization does is it helps us to avoid negative affects such as disgust, fear, and shock. And it also helps us to create psychological distance between us and things that make us feel emotional pain. For example, if you were sitting in A&E and you were overhearing practitioners speaking, you may hear them refer to someone as patient in bed A, patient in bed B, for example. When it comes to thinking about children and young people, we really need to be mindful that by seeing a child's full humanness, it allows us to offer them protection.
Sorry, Afia, you've gone on mute. Well done.
That's okay. I'm not sure if I muted myself.
Thank you.
What that means is that when we don't see a child in their full humanity, we are more likely to treat them with adult severity. And this has huge implications on what resources become available to them or what might be inaccessible to them. And another thing that we really need to keep in mind is how that when we don't see someone's full humanness, it can drive them to not see their own full humanness and the ramifications of that. So Wernick and McCann analysed presidential election candidates and the discourses that were going on around immigrants. And I'm not going to name names, but I think we can all think of a particular presidential candidate. And what Wernick and McCann found was that dehumanization took place in a two-stage process. And this was at the symbolic level and at the physical level. So at the symbolic level, what Wernick and McCann found were that images and imagery were used to depict immigrants as animals, as being unkempt and being uncivilized. And the discourses often included words and phrases such as vile, criminal aliens, and evil in association with immigrants. And this led to a physical level where they saw an increase in violence and aggression towards immigrants and the increased use of forced detention and returning them to their native countries.
Thanks, Sophia. And you're all probably wondering at this point that what has the US presidential election got to do with child exploitation? So they might have used dehumanizing language both at the symbolic level and physical level during the US presidential election. But what has it got to do with children who are exploited? Actually, what we propose is that two-stage process that Warnock and McCann highlighted in the US presidential election, actually it also takes place when we're talking about children and young people who are subject to exploitation. So at a symbolic level, the images that you are more likely to see of children who are perhaps subject to criminal exploitation is of children or adolescents that are out of control, perhaps, those that might choose to wear clothing, for example, like hoodies. And one of the most dominant images in the media is of Black boys who are disenfranchised from society, who are subject to criminal exploitation. And some of the discourses that you see in society and in organizations is language used, which is, for example, drug mules. You might see children referred to as criminals, or you might see people speaking about the child making a lifestyle choice. Now, if you Google any media report on the internet, you will see that our media is notorious for using discourses like drug mules and criminals when referring to children underage. So what is the impact of the symbolic level dehumanization on the physical level for children and young people who are exploited? Well, despite experiencing multiple and significant traumas, these children are more likely to enter the criminal justice system. So there's a higher number of children in custody and in the secure estate who have been subject to child exploitation. And what the evidence suggests is that when they are in these settings, either custody or the secure estate, they are more likely to be subject to restraint, deprivation of liberty, and seclusion. So actually, the US presidential election and the dehumanizing process that took place is very similar to what takes place with children who are exploited.
Excuse me, Romana. I think somebody's not on mute and we've got an awful lot of background noise. Could you check your mute button for us? I'll run down it and mute them as well, Romana. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. So I'm just going to present a couple of other terms that are often used when talking about children who are subject to exploitation, and you'll all be familiar with some of these terms. So, for example, cuckooing, mules, trap house, going country, and plugging. Now, I have a personal dislike the term plugging, and I actively challenge it in services, because if you deconstruct and look at the word plugging, actually what it's referring to is the insertion of drugs into the genital area of children and young people. And there's been a national call for this act to be recognised as a form of sexual abuse or sexual harm or a sexual act in itself. But when we use the word plugging, we invalidate or we don't acknowledge the fact that a child has been humiliated, abused, or traumatized during the process of that act being committed. So I think it's really important for us to interrogate and deconstruct the language that we use on a daily basis.
When we come to think about the consequences of dehumanization, on the slides, which I'll summarize, is a brief snapshot of headings that things may come under when it comes to the implications of dehumanization. And what we can see is that it creates further marginalization of specific groups of people. It also deprives them of their rights and any privileges. And what we can see is that there's an increase of violence and aggression towards certain groups of people that are subject to dehumanization, and that they're more likely to go down the criminal justice route and receive less compassion, whether that's within society or within services. In turn, it legitimizes the use of undue force and the use of harsher sentencing, and that there's collectively a reduced sense of empathy towards them or a drive to understand their true experiences. And what this does do is it drives disconnection within society. And what we can see is described as a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the dominant negative narratives about groups of people who have been dehumanized are all we can see about them. And so anything that doesn't fit this negative narrative becomes invisible to us.
So I guess it's important to look at how dehumanization and psychological dehumanization results in the erosion of innocence in children and young people. So I'll begin by just sharing this study that was conducted by Goff and colleagues in 2014. And what they found in their study was that young Black boys were perceived as less childlike in services. Okay, and as a result of that perception of them being less childlike, they were more likely to be subject to police violence. The second is Oppertow and Fredrickson found that dehumanization is a precondition for genocide and state-sanctioned violence. The third, this is by Ratton and colleagues in 2012, who highlighted that actually the stage and phase adolescence is actually a risk category because actually they are neither identified as children and they are neither adults. They are on the margins. And being on the margins means that they are more prone to dehumanization in the criminal justice system. We're less likely to see them as children, but we're not quite sure if they're adults yet. So as a result, it's a risk category. And then Kennedy and colleagues found that that children and young people presented counter-narratives of their experiences of school exclusion. And what they found that the act of school exclusion was described as dehumanizing by children and young people. So these are just some studies that we've presented here that show how dehumanization erodes innocence in children and young people. So what do we need to do to address some of this? What do we need to think about and critically reflect on? In order to move away from dehumanization, it's important that our practice is humanizing. And the only way that we can do that is by embodying human rights-based practice. And when we do that as practitioners, the first thing that we do is we recognize the child as a child first. Despite what might be going on for them, what type of behavior they might be displaying or engaging in, they are a child first, and that's their developmental stage and phase. The second is focusing on language, actively interrogating and scrutinizing the language that we use. And it always begins by starting with ourselves and then reflecting on others. And the third is recognizing that every single person we come into contact with, whether that's children, whether that's our colleagues, whether that's ourselves, is that we all have basic human needs. We all need to connect, to feel affection and to feel cared for. That's basic. So when we take on a human rights-based practice, this is essentially the foundations of the work that we do.
So how do we change current practice? And that is one of the main reasons as to why this knowledge briefing came about and why we were so keen to get it developed. Included are key principles around the need for reflection. So reflective spaces and reflective teams for practitioners to engage in. And it's imperative that these are facilitated by agencies and facilitators that are well adept in specific sectors, as well as in thinking about child sexual exploitation, child exploitation, and underpinned by the human rights-based approach. This includes supervision and clinical supervision for all practitioners, and this can also be a space where it's dedicated for individual practitioners to reflect on the language that they use and ways to interrogate and improve. There's also a need for services to be psychologically minded and to be trauma aware, and for these to underpin protocol. And there's also a need to ensure that the child's voice, the child's experiences, and the child are central to each stage of planning for that child's care. And a fantastic way to do this is the use of narrative approaches. And there's been a recent paper published by Farouk and colleagues, which has analysed this specific to child exploitation. There's also an important need for us all to interrogate our own language use, but also to be aware of and to challenge the dominant discourses. So whose voice is dominant and why, and what are the implications of this? And lastly, for us to collectively engage in constructive challenge. Now, this isn't becoming shaming or naming or blaming of any individual or any groups or any services or any team. This is us collectively coming together to create a safe space in that we can challenge each other on the language that we use so that we can sustain change.
Myself and Afia wanted to end with the most important question that we asked at the beginning, which is, why is the child crying? By Alice Walker. And thank you so much. We'd welcome any questions, comments or reflections, and we've email addresses as well, so do please get in touch if you have any of the reflections that you come up with afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Romana. We've just got, we're about on time, so that's really well done, Romana and Afia. Thank you very much. We've got one question here. The language used by professionals in meetings and reports can re-traumatise young people. They can be a self-fulfilling prophecy for them when they are victims. So lots and lots of people are asking if we can share email addresses and the presentations. I presume you're happy with that, Romana, Afia. So we'll add them to the recording when we've done. And we'll make sure that the email addresses are in the chat function too, so that Steve, could you pop those in the chat function for us too? Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. I was just going to repeat the question about re-traumatization. I think it's really important for us as practitioners to think about if the child that we are working with currently asked to see their documents, their reports, when they are adults, and can reflect on the relationships that they had with us, what would their opinion be of those reports that were written about them? I think it's so important to kind of think about that, because essentially those documents, those reports are the property of the child. They can ask for them.
Yeah, and I think that's replicated. You know, I know a mum very well whose daughter on her health records had child prostitute at the top. For every practitioner, so when they accessed it, that was what they saw, and that how distressing that is. We've got another one here that says, can you explain more about narrative approaches?
Thank you. So I think for anyone that's interested in looking at the use of narrative approaches with children and young people who are subject to exploitation, we've just this month had a publication in Clinical Psychology Forum. I'd be happy to kind of send people the link to that article where they can have a read of it themselves. But we used those approaches with children who were exploited, and we provide a case study of a child where we use that approach with. So it's a very new and innovative approach, and we've and it's called the Tree of Life. But it's recently been published, and we can provide details of that publication afterwards as well for those that are interested.
There are lots of other questions, but we also know that we've got a very tight schedule, so we'll put these questions together, and if we've got time, we'll pick them up at the end. But Romana, Afia, thank you very much for that presentation. But if we can move on to Space now, so welcome Space. You've got 15 minutes here with the parent perspective on language, when language harms along the way with exploitation.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Brilliant, thank you. So afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us in launching what we hope is going to lead to change and progress for exploited children. For those of you who are not aware, Space deals specifically with county lines related exploitation, children and adults. I'm the founder, and it's an anonymous organisation, hence the blank screen. So just really a few minutes from me to highlight how language and words can play an unwelcome part for those affected by exploitation, child exploitation specifically. We may think we're reporting what we learned or saw, but in a context as far-reaching and harmful as child exploitation. Is our language always safe? Is it always unbiased? Is it always inoffensive and accurate? And does professional language cross over to a place, inadvertently or deliberately, where it leaves those it's about deciphered not only inaccurately, but negatively, and left both disadvantaged by the detrimental and influential pictures that words can create, and damaged long-term by the beliefs, judgments, and decisions that they trigger? So the word accurate is really worth exploring here. Let's take the term drug dealer. A drug dealer is a person who deals drugs, an offence and a crime, one we normally associate with adults, not minors. So within county lines where children are exploited, utilised and trafficked primarily to transport drugs by organised crime groups, child victims are routinely described, as Romana has already mentioned, as drug dealers in statutory reports, law enforcement communications, and the general media. Technically, yes, the children are dealing drugs. But is that the full story? Are we, through language, selecting where a child's story begins, spotlighting aspects that suit us, focusing on points we think are more deserving than others, or simply pushing angles where our vested interests lie? Are we all comfortable that something as massively harmful and potentially life-threatening as child criminal exploitation happening to minors is boiled down to drug dealer? Thankfully, we no longer see female child victims of CSE described as prostitutes. So why is it still acceptable when it comes to children, predominantly boys, being labelled drug dealers in county lines and child criminal exploitation? Why is this language acceptable against the backdrop of child criminal exploitation as the most common UK modern slavery child exploitation category for some time now? The other example, if we're looking at the word accurate, is beyond parental control. You'll see in the briefing, we've made specific mention to this phrase. And it's another example of a negative phrase often used by social workers to describe extrafamilial harm, particularly in protective factor families. Now, we know that the social work model isn't, it's not built for extrafamilial harm. It was for intrafamilial harm. So there aren't very many phrases that really cover this particular epidemic. So lots and lots of our families certainly are seeing beyond parental control being used in their cases. Now, this choice of words plainly tells us parents lack or have lost control over a child, which technically they do or have as a result of the exploitation. But this language equally suggests that a parent or parents are somehow weak and deficient, doing something wrong somewhere, which is problematic when the control is taken from protected parents and exercised from beyond the home by criminal networks. Now, no parent in the world is going to be equipped to control a child who is in the hands of ruthless perpetrators. So why do we shift the lens of responsibility from abusers onto parents? Additionally, exploited, rewired children are also beyond services control. But how often do we read or hear about that? It's the exact same thing that's happening to the parents that services are seeing, you know, in terms of the take up with their engagement or services. So if you're a parent who has raised your children with good morals, good manners and aspirations, kept them safe from birth through childhood and teens, and your children have grown up appreciating and responding positively to this parenting throughout, understood boundaries and behaved as any decent and responsible parent wishes their children to, until extra-familial harm took that child from your control, how would you, as a parent in that situation, find it acceptable to see beyond parental control splashed across statutory reports, influencing life and death outcomes and serving as a negative lifelong footprint? One particular CCE parent who challenged this phrase was informed, it doesn't really mean anything. It is just social work language to describe cases of extrafamilial harm. Except there's no just about this phrase. It's a massive problem. Not only is it inaccurate, but it's also offensive, misleading, and damaging for those at the heart of any statutory intervention. An intervention where there is rightly an expectation that it will be a positive one for both exploited child and their protective family. There cannot be room for inappropriate language in child exploitation, and certainly not in content that is shared beyond our own organisations, as it affects, harms, and influences. Many of our parents are mortified about how their situation is worded, but then realise, to their double horror, that once written, it isn't possible to fully retract, and eventual corrections do nothing to alter negative impressions created by the original versions in the minds of readers far and wide. Affected parents of exploitation have more than enough on their plate. They aren't only fighting off those exploiting their children, they're also facing imminent criminalisation, injury, or death of their child. They're constantly needing to pick their battles around this core firefighting, whilst time is quickly running out. So, understandably, therefore, language isn't high on their list of priorities, but it does end up being forced up that list of priorities due to the negative power, influence, and decision-making arising from inaccurate portrayals of their situation. Biased language becoming yet another priority obstacle to remove in order to reclaim the safety and well-being of their child. Language shouldn't be a concern for parents, and the harm from it certainly shouldn't be competing with the threat from organised crime groups or the current poor statutory response to CCE. But this is the experience of national families. Next slide, please. So clearly obvious what's there. I'll leave you to read that rather than reading it out. Exploited children and their families desperately need language in child exploitation to be exactly as it says there. Is it happening? We're certainly not seeing it. In fact, I would say the opposite is the case. Next one, please. So this is just a really quick rundown of language commonly used in child exploitation, both CCE and CSE, but which are actually poor examples as they're viewed through the lens of choice and complicity, and places the onus to be or do better or differently onto children and families rather than the intervening safeguarding professionals. I'm sure you're all very familiar with many of these, but this is bread and butter for so many of our parents, and really we just shouldn't be seeing this anymore. It's hugely damaging, and it's very clear where the blame lies when we use language like this. Next one, please. So talking specifically about when language harms, these are some more examples where, you know, again, the emphasis is on complicity or suggestion of guilt. So these, you know, we will see these on social media, on official reports. You know, they are everywhere. These terms are absolutely everywhere. And it's not just the damage to those involved, but actually it's actually influencing the public who don't know the ins and outs or both sides of the story, because it's telling the public that these children are criminals. And there are sadly still lots and lots of people in society who do not know about county lines and the fact that you know, most of the operators, if we want to use that word, are exploited children who are propping up these drug networks. And I think, you know, this sort of usage of language here is absolutely setting an inaccurate scene for those people who don't know, and will then walk away thinking, okay, so, you know, the children are actually the problem, and it couldn't be further from the truth. And we hear, you know, travel to a fair bit in the context of missing cases, and I've just attached a link to a blog from us, which was published just a month ago to coincide with International Missing Children's Day. So travel to comes up a lot when these children are trafficked across the UK for the purposes of county lines activity. And, you know, as basic as it sounds, they didn't travel to, they've been exploited and trafficked. And actually just writing that instead of travel to, you can see it makes a massive difference already in the way that people will register that information or process that information. You know, traveled gives the sense that the child has, you know, made a conscious decision to do X, Y, and Z, and has ended up, you know, in the different corners of the country. And that just, you know, that just isn't the case. It's absolutely trafficking. So there is a real reluctance to use the word trafficking, and, you know, it's about time we started calling things as they were. When we're talking about exploitation, children do not travel to, they are trafficked to. Another example that we see a huge amount, particularly on social media posts, is from police accounts where they're describing young people who've been apprehended, having run off from the officers. Yep, technically they will have run off, but actually, you know, what's actually happening there? A lot of the times the children are running off not because they have any fear of being arrested and being criminalized. That's so low down on their list of priorities. They're running off because they know they will be entering debt bondage to their exploiters as a result of the drugs and the money that's going to be seized by the police. Now, you know, we can write ran off in a social media post, people will read that, but actually at that point, the police don't know that that young child is exploited or not. There's an assumption of guilt made there by the fact that, you know, you're writing ran off. I mean, you know, these are minor things, and the kind of difference they make when you report them in the way we're seeing, it makes a massive difference to how things will then progress or develop. Again, you know, talking about plugging, Romana's already mentioned reference to that. There seems a real resistance to view that as a sexual offence and as sexual abuse. Now, no child is going to enter into plugging as a rite of passage, yet that's exactly how it's described. Certainly within certain statutory agencies. We kind of lose sight of the fact that that activity is linked to a child, and that is actually sexual abuse. And we need to, again, start describing things as they are, rather than making excuses for what's going on. The word lifestyle choice is something we've launched at the same time as we came on the scene. It's a real bugbear of mine, because this is something that is described across the piece, a lifestyle choice into criminality. It isn't. It's actually modern slavery. But there is, again, a real reluctance to even call exploitation in the context of criminal or sexual. There is a real reluctance, where British nationals are concerned, to call that slavery. Now we need to be asking ourselves why that is. Next one, please. So this particular slide refers to some communication by police relating to the execution of a number of drugs warrants and the subsequent arrest of a 21-year-old man and a 15-year-old youth. Now, we don't know whether exploitation was a factor, but we know that it features in too many cases and it's regularly not picked up. Now, that example drew my attention because the UN definition of youth is persons aged between 15 and 24. So I asked myself, why has the 21-year-old been described as a man, not a youth? And why has the 15-year-old been described as a youth, not a child? I think you can see where I'm going with that. And as harmless as it sounds, does it subtly adultify the two individuals concerned, but particularly the minor? Is that a choice to write it that way? Next slide, please. Just
2 minutes now, please. Thank you.
So I'm going to come to a close now, but hope that you enjoy the rest of the launch and find the briefing to be a useful tool, not only for reflection, but hopefully adjustment in language too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Space. I think it's a very, very clear message that you're asking there, and we forget quite often to explore the consequences of these young people saying no, to the child saying no. We forget the consequences that they might face. We will come, there are a few questions, Space, but we'll come back at the end in that I hope we can still make sure that we hear from all the presenters for the same amount of time. So we're over now to Lynette Reed and Shauna Breen, who are Birmingham's Children Trust, the Empower You Hub, and they're both exploitation and missing coordinators. Over to you, Lynette and Shauna.
Thank you, Sheila. Lynette, are you all right to share the presentation?
Yep.
Okay.
Technical skills are not.
Perfect, thank you. So afternoon everyone, my name's Shauna Breen and I'm going to be presenting to you today with my colleague Lynette Reed. We are 2 of the 5 exploitation and missing coordinators based within the Empower You Hub, which is our exploitation and missing hub within Birmingham Children's Trust. And we just wanted to really talk through kind of what it is that we're doing in Birmingham, and give some kind of real life examples of the language that we're hearing on a daily basis and also how we're challenging that language. So next slide. Okay, so we started on a language journey in Birmingham back in 2016, when we recognised that we wasn't where we wanted to be in terms of the language that we were using as professionals when we were talking about and describing children and their families. You know, we didn't want to come into this presentation today all singing or dancing, we are perfect, do what we're doing, but we're absolutely on a journey. We're not where we need to be in terms of language, but it feels like, you know, it is very much a journey that we're trying to get to a space where not only us as Birmingham Children's Trust employees are using language that's appropriate, but also our partners as well. So what we're trying to do is kind of change culture throughout the whole of the organisation, and then share that learning with other organisations that we work with. So being a multi-agency hub has brought, you know, lots of challenges and led us to recognising differences in baseline understandings and the impact of language use. So we're kind of trying to get our own house in order, if you like, and then also have the challenges of working with other professionals, you know, that sit around the table with us on a daily basis. So not only are we trying to change our own language, but we're also trying to change the language that's kind of in and around us as well. So we encourage commitment from assistant director level and all of our senior management to commit to on-the-spot challenges around poor language use with their teams, and also sharing this practice throughout the trust, because we recognise it's all well and good for us within the hub to be, you know, using the appropriate language, but actually what we want is for the whole organisation to be on the same page as us. And when we're doing on-the-spot challenges, it really holds people accountable to make sure that the language they're using is appropriate when we're talking about not only victims of exploitation or children and families that are experiencing extrafamilial harm, but actually for every child and family that's accessing our services in Birmingham. Next slide, Lynette. Okay, so in terms of the commitment, so we're checking and addressing our own language, but trying to make sure that we do that out loud. It's all well and good, you know, us telling other people about the language that we're using, but we also recognise that we don't always get it right. So there's a real commitment that actually if something does come out of our mouths, that actually we speak that out loud and say, actually, that wasn't the appropriate language to use, let me reframe that. And also kind of, you know, challenging each other within the team and saying, actually, let's talk about the way that you frame that sentence. So, you know, holding ourselves accountable as well as holding other professionals accountable as well. We're committed to on-the-spot positive challenge around language and adultification of children affected by contextual safeguarding issues. So, you know, we've heard through the other presentations, you know, the language that we use will ultimately have a huge impact on the safeguarding that that child and that family receives. So on the spot challenge allows us to say, actually, let's have a look at the language that's used there, and let's have a look at kind of how that impacts. And it absolutely isn't to embarrass people, but when we're all on this journey together, we all need to be held accountable for the things that come out of our mouths. We're committed to leading by example and addressing the impact of negative language use for children and families through service user feedback. So we're trying to pull in children, young people and their families in to say, actually, what does it do when a professional calls you a child prostitute? What does that do to you and your family? Or how does that make you feel? You know, you're a 15-year-old, you're being called a drug dealer or a gang member. Actually, what impact does that have? And, you know, how can we do better? So it's making sure that we're getting that service user feedback and making sure that we're not only hearing, but we're listening to the voices of the families that we're trying to support. Setting clear expectations and parameters within meetings regarding the language used around children and their families. So when we start off our meetings, we kind of set the parameters that this is the expectation of the language that's used within this forum. And actually, if there is language that, you know, isn't appropriate or feels slightly uncomfortable, we will challenge you on that. So people know what to expect when they have conversations with us or when they come into our meetings in terms of what language should be used. And then also the recognition that media and social stimulus affects our language use through subliminal messages, both inside and outside of our professional lives. So thinking about, you know, when things are said on TV or you read something in the newspaper, actually recognise that that's not okay, even though that we're not in work. And I think there's something in, you know, it's all well and good using, you know, appropriate language, if you like, whilst we're at work, but also let's take that home into our families and make sure that this isn't just a professional shift that we're having. It needs to be a whole culture shift and a societal shift as well. Next slide, Sarah. And then just before I hand over, I just wanted to give you kind of some really poor examples, really, you know, not to name and shame by any means, but just kind of something to leave you with, to really think about how damaging this would be. And these are real life examples of, you know, sentences that have been used within the Empower You Hub quite recently. So the first one being, this child has gone missing as she wishes to prostitute herself freely. Professionals do not understand this child. The adults in the community and older members of this gang are fearful of him as he has a gun. And that one relates specifically to a very, very young child. And then this child has had non-consensual sex. And one of the things that we're really trying to push is don't be scared to use the correct language. Actually, we're not talking about non-consensual sex. That's not even a word. Let's call it what it is. This child has been raped. And I think, you know, what we're trying to really do is encourage professionals not to be frightened of using the right language. Let's call it what it is. So the adultification of children using the statements above leads to lack of humility and compassion for the child and severely impacts on the safeguarding response that they and their families receive.
Thanks, Shauna. My name's Lynette Reed. I'm Shauna's colleague from the Trust. And as Shauna said in the last slide, really, you know, we hear this language being used by our partners, by our professionals in Birmingham on a daily basis. And I think for us, it's really important, as Afia and Romana have said at the beginning, it's really important for us to refocus our language from blame, shame and guilt to invoke emotion and enable, empower and give hope, to encourage and inspire. And that we do acknowledge as professionals that language has the power to oppress and disempower and dehumanize. And the ramifications of this are huge for families and children that we work with when we're creating professional psychological distancing, really. Don't be afraid to challenge poor language. As Shauna says, we have committed in Birmingham to on-the-spot challenge. We are committed to setting parameters in every forum where we're having informal or formal discussions in Birmingham. And we wanted to give some examples of how we do that, because we are aware how difficult it is. And even, you know, from a psychological level, how defensive we can get as professionals when we're challenged on the spot in open forums with our colleagues, as well, and what impacts that has for our relationships. So a good tool to use appropriately to challenge language is to reframe sentences sometimes to make it more appropriate. So, you know, often I will use paraphrasing in meetings. So I quite like not to be chosen first to speak in meetings, to hear what everybody else and our partners are saying, and then try sort of summarising and paraphrasing what's already been said and shared in the meeting around concerns, around risk, around challenges, around vulnerability, about experimentation, and around significant risk and harm, rather than taking a direct challenge. Can be useful sometimes. It doesn't expose the person that you are trying to reflect with, and it doesn't make them feel vulnerable or chastised in a public environment. So sometimes just paraphrasing and reflecting that back in the meeting of, so what I have heard so far during the meeting is, and then using different language and reflecting it back, I've found it's really other professionals and partners are very receptive to that, and they'll generally sort of come back to you and say, that's really well put, thanks very much. So rather than becoming defensive when we're challenging in those open forums. Also using, so can I just check what you mean there? What I'm hearing is we need to be mindful of the language we're using. This child has been identified as a victim, as vulnerable and at risk of significant harm. So for me, we're talking about a child that actually is fearing physical assault, is fearing rape and crimes being committed against them, is seeming their activities are leading me to believe they are proactively trying to protect other family members by not being in the environment where they feel that they're a target, and therefore there's transferable risks to families. This child has limited availability of choice. The decisions are simple when there's really no alternative for that child. I think, again, going back to the language that we use, in case discussions in Birmingham, we tried to create, I think some space already alluded to, safe spaces to challenge practice, but being self-reflective as well and self-critical, as Sean has already spoken about, and acknowledging our own challenges to consistently using appropriate and protective positive and protective language, which doesn't victim blame, has been really useful for us. Reassuring workers in those discussions that we know that they're doing their best. We're not at all challenging because we think they are intentionally using bad language around our young people. That actually we acknowledge that all of our workforce and all of our practitioners' intentions come from a really good place, and actually they want to do their best, and they have been doing their best until now. And actually what it's about is us being reflective, knowing that, acknowledging that we know different now, and that we have a duty to do better for our children and our families in Birmingham. And we have a duty to be the best practitioner that we can be as well. So challenging current culture and practice to do better for families is our aim in Birmingham. We are all, as Afia mentioned earlier, impacted, and as Sean has alluded to on the previous slide, impacted by media narratives, racial profiling, marketing, subliminal messaging in our modern society as we go about our daily business privately and personally and professionally. And I even personally find it a daily task to check my own language when writing case notes, when writing reports, when discussing activities of concerns in meetings, and etc. But I believe, again, that we have a duty individually as well as a collective to commit really to consistently trying our best. And in Birmingham, we have an expectation of this with all of our practitioners, including senior management and at leadership levels. So our commitment moving forward in Birmingham to parents, children, the community, being involved in the development as we move forward in the hub. The hub in Birmingham, Empower You Hub, has been running now for just over 18 months. And developing at quite a rapid pace. We did acknowledge that how important it is for us to have the views of parents and children and our community, especially as contextual safeguarding in Birmingham, and our responses sort of widen from sort of child exploitation, criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation, to include serious youth violence, gangs, and peer-on-peer exploitation as well. We can't develop services without better understanding the experiences and the views of those involved. And it's not just parents that are affected with serious youth violence and criminality and gangs, or the individual child. There's a collective impact for the communities that these young people are navigating as well, and the wider families and children in those communities. We'll continue to challenge language and promote positive culture change in Birmingham through all of our presentations and all of the sort of practice work that we do from the hub. And again, coming back to leading by example and ensuring that when we use inappropriate language ourselves, we hold ourselves and each other accountable to do better. That we share our learning and our knowledge around the impact of poor language and the use throughout and beyond our organisation. And that we really acknowledge that just how important language is for adolescent children when they are forming their identity as adolescents and young people, and as they are going through adolescent development. And I think I just wanted to touch on as well, as Sean has also said, that we encourage really the use of legal language in meetings rather than psychological distancing of our practitioners. You know, we don't want to hear non-consensual sex, or this child's alleged that somebody forced a penis in their mouth. Actually, what we're discussing here is the oral rape of a child. And actually what it does is it creates more urgency. It makes the discussion real. And, you know, unfortunate for us as practitioners, we have chosen to come into an agenda where actually we don't live in a just society. Bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people is the reality. And therefore we have a duty to acknowledge the reality of what we are working in, if we're committed to getting it right. And we wanted to finish on my favourite quote when I am challenging practice, and I want to reassure practitioners that they haven't just spent an hour with me being reprimanded and chastised for their language, is that we all do our best until we know better, but we've got a duty then, when we know better, to actually do better as a practitioner and as an individual in society, making a contribution to our own communities as residents. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sheena and Lynette. That was a really, really practical application of how we might visit this language journey, and loads and loads of comments. We fortunately don't have time for questions at the moment. We are running over time, so I'm just going to move swiftly on and come back to the questions that we can come back to shortly. So next we're wanting to hear from Julie Howe, who's the Chief Inspector at the Force Vulnerability Team for Dorset Police. So Julie, welcome, and I think Afia is going to share your presentation for you.
Thank you, Afia. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for letting me be here today. It's a really hard to follow such good presentations, but I just perhaps would like to start by sharing with you why this guidance and this discussion is so important to us all as professionals. If you could just pop onto that slide for me. Thank you, Afia. I think we all work alongside children who are at risk of exploitation or who are being exploited. And the language that we all use in our professions has such a massive impact on their parents, on their carers, on the children themselves, but also on us as professionals as well. So I haven't always been a police officer. I started my career as an advocate working with parents with learning disabilities whose children were the subject of care proceedings. And I think that was back in sort of 2006. And I really started to understand how disempowering language can be. It's hard enough to battle your way through the court system as a parent if you're on the other end of those care proceedings, let alone if you're a parent who has expressive or receptive or any kind of language delays. It's an absolute minefield. And trying to help parents understand what's going on and just to deconstruct some of what's being said around the decisions, the life-changing decisions that are going to be made for them and their family, really sort of made me question, why do professionals talk in this way? Why do they rely so heavily on the language and the jargon that they use with one another? Why don't we just tell people it as it is? Because it's much easier to get them to work alongside us, and it's much easier for them to understand the cause of the problem if we're just talking in plain language to them. I then spent some time working for Bernardo's as the children's charity, working with teenage parents, and faced exactly the same thing. We're asking these teenagers to parent very young children when they've had difficult childhoods themselves, but we're not using language that's accessible to them or that they understand. And then we're criticising them when they don't follow the guidance or they don't conform to the norms that we're setting for what we expect of parents. I then went on to do my social work degree and worked as a women's safety worker. And again, working for the probation service, we use terminology that's asking victims who are the subject of trauma, who are trying to parent children, to do things that we're not explaining properly. And I think it probably reached a peak for me around the language was when I went to work for CAFCAS as a children's guardian, where I spent 10 years representing the voice of children in court proceedings, and just trying to understand and navigate children through that system where, again, people are making life-changing decisions for these children with very little understanding of what's going on for that child. And actually it's at that point when we really started, I think in around 2010, to look at language and how important language is in terms of getting it right for children and their families. And I think having then moved on and working in Dorset Police now, it's something that we're slightly more behind in, certainly than other services, but we are now starting to look at as an organisation around how does our language disempower people, and how do we make the processes more difficult when we're trying to work alongside them. Can I have the next slide, please, Afia? So this slide, I won't talk you through it because it's fairly self-explanatory. As a social worker, we talked in numbers, and I'm sure there are many social workers on this call today who can identify that we talk about Section 7 reports, Section 17s, 47s, 20s, 31s, Rule 16.4 guardians, and it's really confusing to us as professionals to know what some of these things mean, let alone the children and families that we're trying to help and trying to support along the way. In police, we use acronyms, PPOs, ASBs, YOTS, DVPOs, IDVAs, ISVAs. And again, most of us don't know what those expressions even mean, but we're expecting the families and the children that we work alongside to be able to cotton on to our language. And actually, I think it creates even more of a power imbalance that we already have as professionals when we're trying to work alongside children and their families. And I think in order to demonstrate why this is so harmful to the work that we do and actually undermine some of the good practice that we're all trying to achieve, I'd just like to share really a bit of a story with you. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Afia. So I just wanted to talk to you really about Daniel. So I first became aware of Daniel a couple of years ago, and I was working as a critical incident inspector in Dorset Police. And this child kept coming to my notice as somebody who was regularly being abusive in the town centre, spitting, being abusive to security staff, shoplifting, aggressive, stealing for other people. I think there was something like 32 dispersal notices to remove him from the town centre, and he wasn't in education. And when I'm reviewing his latest missing episode and realising that he's been hit with another dispersal notice, I went back through all of the files and started to look at, why is nobody asking what's going on for this child? Why are we constantly talking about this 12-year-old, as he was at the time, as somebody who's abusive, that's intimidating, that's aggressive to police? We're not actually understanding what's going on for him. And again, it struck me that we're not listening, we're not using the right language. There's got to be more for this. So asking that question, what is going on for this young person? So I sought out the police officers and the PCSOs that most frequently have contact with Daniel. And I learnt the real story, what was really going on for Daniel. And I think this is so important in terms of understanding what the language is about. Could I have the next slide, please, Afia? Actually, what Daniel is telling officers and what he is telling our PCSO is that there's domestic abuse at home. He doesn't want to be at home. His mum is being subjected to really serious violence. He's got a sibling, an older sibling in the home, who is also being extremely violent towards him. His mum's misusing substances. He doesn't have contact with his dad. Only the week before we'd had this conversation, his mum had been self-harming and using alcohol. And there are no boundaries, and that's not his mum's fault. She's got her own difficulties. This is not about being beyond parental control, and I'll pick up on the language that was used earlier. This is about mum not being supported to be able to provide the care that Daniel needs. And actually, all of that information came from the PCSO, who is filling in the public protection notifications that alerts children's services, filling in the dispersal notices and asking the inspector for authorisation, and also filling in various other forms and missing children reviews. And none of this information is captured. What we've done is describe the behaviour that we're seeing. We're not describing the experience that Daniel's having. And I think at that point, I realised that actually we've got to do something about this in Dorset Police, because we are, you know, a sort of end of a county line there. We deal with lots of missing and exploited children. How many other children are we letting down by using the wrong language? It is so important that we are telling the story for this child, that we're not describing the behaviour, that we're not talking about blaming this child for what's going on, that we are truly understanding what his experience is, because until we're understanding these children's experiences, we're not able to help them, and we're letting them down, and we become part of the problem, not the solution. And I'm going to be really quick because I know we're really behind on time, so I'm hoping I can make that up for you. So if we could just go on to the next slide, and I'll just sort of talk about what we're doing in Dorset at the moment. So the sort of work that I'm trying to do with officers and staff in Dorset Police at the moment is that helping them to recognise that as police officers, we often have more contact with a child or a young person than their social workers, quite often their teachers, and that actually this is a privilege. This is a really good opportunity for us to understand what's going on for these young people, and to help our colleagues and to help our partners to understand the context of what's going on for these children so that we can help them. I'm trying to get them to understand that actually we need to use ethnography, or in plain language, we need to tell them the story for this child. We need their experiences to leap off the page. When we're sending a public protection notification, it's no good just writing section 35 issued or been caught spitting at a security guard. We need to explain the context behind that, because that's where the real help can happen. That's where we can make a difference. And then trying to encourage a culture of understanding the power that we already have as police officers. So we have a uniform, we have legal powers, we've already got power. We don't need to use our language, we don't need to use our terminology to increase our importance or our presence. We need to help to speak to children in a way that they understand, that takes some of those barriers away and take some of that power imbalance away. And then we're also looking at trying to encourage officers and staff to remember that one day they may get to see everything you write about them. And it's important to have that humility and to recognise the disadvantages that they have around their age and understanding, the peer pressure and the unknown factors that we might not know about that influence their behaviour, and to describe the behaviour, not the child. And I think it's so important that as people who have the privilege and have chosen to go into professions where we work alongside children who are exploited and who are vulnerable, that we do them justice, because we're not there to make them feel worse about themselves. There's plenty of people out in the world that want to do that for them. We're there to help. And actually, that's our responsibility as police officers, as social workers, in any field that we work in. We have a responsibility to these young people to do the best we can for them. And that brings me to the end of that presentation. So I'm hoping I've saved you loads of time, but I'm happy to take any questions if we've got a bit of time.
Let me have a look. Let's just go back to you have saved us loads of time. Thank you very much. We are still running a bit late. So could we save your questions till the end, Julie? Thank you for that.
Happily.
Yeah. So lots and lots of observations in there, and people recognising the value of understanding the history and the context of where a young person is. So thank you for that, Julie. So I'd just like to welcome Joe. Joe's the founder of Enthusiasm Trust. So over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my slot's meant to finish in 8 minutes. I'll try and do my best to have it done within 8 minutes. It's lovely to be with you today. As Sheila said, I'm the founder of Enthusiasm. It's a charity that's based in Derby, but we also do work nationally with a number of police forces, organisations from the West Midlands, Northumbria, Cumbria, and lots of other places. So my journey realistically started, I got into this field and this world purely by accident. And you'll kind of understand why language is important to me as I kind of carry on with the presentation. And it's been fantastic to hear all of the great stuff today. But I want to throw something in here. Actions speak louder than words. So actually somebody wrote in the chat box, behaviour is a language. So really powerful. So I just want to throw that in. Speak louder than words. Now let me just talk to you in the context of what I mean by that. I'm actually Italian, hence the name Russo. And there's this phrase, la parola, which basically means the word, and it means your word. And actually your word and what comes out of your mouth isn't just this abstract thing that fires out, but it's actually who you are. It's what you believe. It's what you understand. And it is so much more than just a word and just language. So we can't separate our language, our words, from our actions and from our being. They are inextricably linked. So in 1992, I started a youth club because I wanted to help some kids on an estate. And it was really interesting. That youth club became a charity in 2000. And I remember going to one of my first ever meetings, and we talked about this person as a client. I'm like, a client, what is that? And it was really interesting to me. They were talking about a young person as a client. And I was kind of doing a little bit of a Google search. And the word client, very simply, is a buyer, a customer, or a receiver of services. And so I kind of thought, in terms of some of the organizations that I was working with, when they referred to the term client, how did they see that individual? Because we talk about dehumanizing, we talk about how language has that impact. And it was really powerful to me to see actually what that young person is not, that young person doesn't need a service. What they need is connection. They need relationship. And the title of my talk today is Connection Maker, Connection Breaker. And sometimes through our language, we break those connections, but actually through our language, we can also make those connections. So there's a lot of talk at the moment. Everywhere I turn, everybody talks about theory of change. And our theory of change is about developing a journey and a relationship with young people and moving along. Within the practice guidance, and when I first got to meet Romana, some of the work that we did, there's three things I just want to kind of highlight around language. We always speak about our young people as children, so we got to meetings and we talk to them about as children. I've often sat in many meetings where they're referred to as manipulative, as charismatic. Oh, look at them, they're drawing other kids. And here's a classic one, defiant. Now you tell me a child who isn't defiant and growing up. And so we will often continually refer to using that simple word, child. And that's been used all the way through the session. Another element in terms of ensuring that we don't kind of see the child in the wrong perspective is when we do we have a referral system. We try and almost keep as much information away from the engagement workers as possible so that they don't go into those meetings with already preconceived ideas. And then the third thing is we have a mentoring program. We don't have high, medium or low. We actually talk about platinum, gold and silver, which is based around levels of need and levels of support actually. So again, we can talk about high risk or low risk. What does that mean? Because a low risk to me may well be a high risk to yourselves. So as an organization, we've developed practice, but actually that practice is embedded within a sense of compassion and of love. And it's embedded within actually wanting to show kindness to those individuals. And as we say, if we're talking about dehumanizing language, we want to humanize people. We want to see them become who they really are. And what I've learned over the years is actually words and language have the propensity, as was on Romana's very first slide, to burden, to shame, and to demonize. And so often when we look at those words and how we use language, and remember when I'm talking about language and I'm talking about words, I'm talking about where our actions that link with that and what we actually do. So again, I saw a fabulous tweet from Space, I think it was, saying, just because a referral that someone's been referred to safeguarding doesn't actually mean we've done anything with that person. So it's about language and words. And what I've also learned is when we speak in such a negative, demonizing way, there's a lot of theory out there that says more about the person who's delivering that language than it does about the individual who's receiving that. So language has the ability to burden, to demonize and to shame. And if that's true, language also has the potential and the ability to build people up. Give you a little bit of context. So I'm severely dyslexic. I was diagnosed with dyslexia as 30 years old. So I went through most of my childhood years being called lazy, stupid, and a disappointment. And so when you grow up with a lot of that kind of stuff, it kind of gives you those elements of hang-ups. And I guess it's what shaped and challenged me of wanting to kind of reach out to other folks that I felt I had an element of connection. But language has this great ability to also do the exact opposite. And language can bring healing. Language can give life. And language can actually help folks shape into being the person that they really are. So when we're looking at language, it's so important that we understand that what we say and how we say it has that impact, but it's what's behind that language. It's our actions that are also really critical. Just I'm going to try and draw to a close, but some of the greatest influences upon me and sort of the work that I had been looking at and been doing, and is some fantastic work in Los Angeles. Many of you will be probably familiar with a lot of great work that's going on in Glasgow with the Glasgow Violence Reduction Unit. And a massive influence on the Glasgow VRU is a project called the Homeboy Industry Project, which is based in LA. And they talk about compassion, they talk about kindness, and they talk about actually people being connected to one another. So within the factor of our language, what's also really important, what we've got to get under the surface and what we've got to get underneath all of the language is also that sense of heart, that kindness and that compassion. Because again, actions speak louder than words. If I say to you, I love you, that means nothing if it's just about words. There's got to be elements of action. And again, don't just view the language element as a negative. Yes, it is negative. We've heard a lot of that today. But actually, in terms of our language and what we use and how we build people up, it's also a massively important thing. If you get chance, Google Homeboy Industries, look at some of the talks on there, look at some of the stuff about shaping and changing. A lot of folks talk about trauma awareness and trauma informed. Actually, we need to be compassion driven. We need to have that sense of that kindness. As was said at the very beginning, why is the baby crying? We need to be able to attend to those issues and provide that support. And just on a final note, one of the other projects I'm currently involved in is a project called the Oasis Restore. And Oasis Restore is going to be the first new in 2022 launching of the first Secure Academy, and a lot of the language within that is actually changing. We're not going to be referring to guards, we're going to be referring to youth workers, we're not going to be referring to cells, we're going to be talking about bedrooms, we're not going to be referring to offenders, we're going to be talking about students. So language has this ability to break and make connections, and it's through that human connection with people, with human beings, that actually we see people progress and become their best selves. So thank you for that. I've tried to save a bit of time for you, Sheila, so I'm going to be quiet on that.
You've done a fab job at that, Joe. Really concise and some really important messages in there. So yes, really thankful for that. So thank you. I think we're moving now to Afia and Steve, who are going to introduce you to the practice and knowledge briefing.
I'd first like to thank my co-authors, so Steve Bagley over at the NWG, Space, and Dr. Romana Farouk. But I also want to extend a special thank you to the guest speakers here today. I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing your talks today. I know I had prior insight into what might have been discussed, but hearing it live has been really great. So I'm going to come on to the summary of the knowledge briefing. So to give a bit of a background as to why we wanted to create such a document, but also to give a bit of insight into what you'll find in the document itself. So first and foremost, why is language important? And we all use language to connect, to understand who we are and also who other people are. So language plays a big role in how our identity is shaped. And it also plays a big role in terms of how children develop their identity, so how they are spoken to. but also how whose narratives are reinforced and what they say about us and the implications from that. When we think about children and young people who have been or who are subject to exploitation, what we can be confident is that a lot of the narratives continue to be negative and risk orientated. These narratives are used to oppress children and young people, to convince them that they are worthless, and to trap children and young people in the cycle of experiences which reinforce these false narratives about who they are and how society should see them. We have all heard of at least some of the very high-profile cases where language has played a significant role in the trajectory of poor care provided to children and young people and their families. So, for example, we're all familiar with the Victoria Climbié Serious Review, where identified was a pattern of privilege in adult care and narratives. And what was most harrowing was that Victoria's version of her story was never heard. More recent examples of this we can see in 2021 alone. So over in City and Hackney, the Child A Serious Review, where there were concerns about suspected fabricated or induced illness. And this included the use of prescription opioids for pain management. And this covered the period from birth to about age 11 years old. The learning from this review taught us that practitioners didn't listen to the voice of the child, and there was a general acceptance of what mother said and a general response to this without any objective assessment. And this led to unnecessary and inappropriate medical intervention. The lack of professional challenge and curiosity also culminated in this ongoing medicalisation. And when we look at the recommendations in this review, we can see that central to this was the need to embed the voice of the child in procedures and in training, and to ensure that children are involved at each stage of their care. Another example over in Medway, the Baby Harris case. So Baby Harris was found dead in the family home after having been asleep in parents' bed. To provide a bit of context, the learning from this review was that, again, there was a lack of professional understanding around the lived experiences of Baby Harris's older brother, which could have alerted professionals to risks and harms, and that Baby Harris and Baby Harris's brother were invisible. And again, if we look at the recommendations in this review, it includes improving engagement with children and having an understanding of their lived experiences. And if we look at a case of a 15-year-old girl, and this is a child sexual exploitation case, this review focuses on the lack of professional curiosity on the child's lived experience, and also that this resulted in the perception of the known sexual activity as being assumed as consensual. So practitioners play a pivotal role in shaping the identity of children and young people that they do come into contact with. And this is at a time that is crucial that we consciously challenge a child or young person's core beliefs about who they are, especially if it's negative. We need to reinforce narratives that these children and young people cannot be forgotten about or excluded from communities, and that narratives about these young people need to foster a sense of responsibility to ensure that these young people are cared for and nurtured by society. This is why this practice guidance is so important, and that a knowledge briefing like this and attending to language is so important. And that also attending to language requires a whole systems approach, and this means that all services a child and young person comes into contact with needs to be on board, and that we need frontline members of staff, but also extending towards senior levels of management within organisations to be on board. So what does this guidance mean for you as practitioners and services? Well, this knowledge briefing offers practitioners key areas to reflect on when scrutinising their language and language used within services is important. And this is service-wide and sector-wide. It also encourages practitioners and teams within services to embark on this journey of discovery, and a journey which involves becoming accustomed to collectively challenging language use within services, especially when it perpetuates negative and stereotypical views of children and young people. And as part of this knowledge briefing, it was important for us to not only draw on current evidence base, which offers a balanced view of what is found within social and psychological theory, but also to embed practical examples of services from various sectors about their direct experiences of the impact of language use on the child, on the young person, and their family networks. The scope of this briefing offers insight into how language steers the trajectory of a child and young person's status within society, the resources that become available or inaccessible to them, and consequently, what shapes their future. And in addition to this, the guidance provides key areas of services to consider. And this is when supporting practitioners to attend to language that they use, and also to scrutinise the impact this is evidenced to have on the lives of children, young people and their families. This process is by no means intended to incite institutional shame or the shaming of individuals within teams. It's really crucial that when using this briefing, it's adopted in its entirety so that it avoids such things as shaming, blaming and guilt. What we do emphasise is that this guidance and the processes within it directly support the preceding and succeeding parts. So essentially what we hope to see from the use of this knowledge briefing is an impact at not just the frontline level, but also service-wide and sector-wide. In order to successfully attend to language, we hope that this knowledge briefing provides the foundation of a much needed journey of reflection and action. And drawing on what Joe has briefly said, language isn't just the words we use, it's also how it influences our actions and behaviours. A journey that is required to be endorsed by all within services, and for this briefing to be the catalyst for which organisational cultures evolve to become more aware of the impacts of the language they use and the importance of this shaping the child or young person's identity. We also anticipate seeing the beginnings of sector-wide transition to attending to language, and in specifically scrutinising whose narratives are being privileged and why. From this, we hope to see the offer of better care to children and young people subject to exploitation, meaning that practitioners and services are becoming more adept in scrutinising and being more involved in challenging discourses which omit the child's voice. Lastly, we hope to see future good practice examples from services attending to and interrogating language use, specifically within respective sectors and across sector-wide. And as part of the knowledge briefing and in the launch today, we have included and highlighted the great work currently underway within social care, police, and within third sector agencies and parent-led agencies also. What we do not want to do is for this to be where the great work ends. And I personally will be very encouraged to connect with organisations to think about language use and also to hear about the great work being undertaken in services in the near future. And I cannot emphasise enough how great an opportunity this launch and knowledge briefing is to connect not only with the guest speakers here today, but also to hear about the great work and to share thinking and reflections across services within your sector and sector-wide. And so one of my things that has always been in my mind leading up to this launch is the more services involved, the bigger the impact will be. So I emphasize again, please share and connect. Thank you.
Thank you, Afia. Sorry, Steve, I thought you were talking as well, so I was waiting for you, but clearly Afia's got the stage this time, so thank you, Afia. There was she did a good job for you, didn't she? Lots and lots of questions coming up. We have got a few minutes, so if I start at the top, Ramana and Afia, this one was for you. Should we ask professionals to be trauma responsive rather than just trauma aware?
Thanks, Sheila. And I'm sure Afia will have some reflections on that question. I was intrigued by it because I think organisations and practitioners are on a journey in terms of becoming trauma aware, trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, and then eventually trauma informed. And I've often said this at conferences that I've presented at. I'm yet to come across a service that I would say is truly trauma informed, because I think that's a journey that people have to go on. I think the first step, and hence that's why we've kind of included it in our presentation, is to become trauma aware. Then we can begin to build on that learning and development and growth and think about being trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, trauma informed. I guess it's the first step that we were kind of encouraging practitioners and organisations to take. I wasn't sure if Afia wanted to kind of add anything to that.
You did summarise that quite nicely for me, but my addition would just be to emphasise that you need to have a strong foundation of being trauma aware before you can effectively work in trauma responsive way or trauma informed way, for example.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. There's another one here for Space. Space, what would you say to adults who are exploited as children in terms of language?
I would just use the example actually that's come up recently. I think I've mentioned it in the chat, where a survivor who's now an adult went into the NRM not realizing at all that they were actually exploited and groomed for decades, and then hearing certain things around them, eventually got into the NRM and was trying to access counselling, because mental health is on, right at the top of the list for exploited children. And if that's not addressed, then you've got an adult who's dealing with that. But interestingly, the questionnaire that came back from the service, counselling service, where they had to, tick the most appropriate answer to a question. Well, the question was, I can imagine a future from selling sex. Circle the answer that applies the most. Not at all, only occasionally, sometimes, often, most of the time. Now, that's come through a trafficking service, and that trafficking service is asking what, somebody who's now an adult, whether their exploitation as a child boils down to how they feel about selling sex. So if that was aimed at a child, the child would not necessarily have picked up on it. But actually, that's an adult reading that and thinking, hold on a second, why is this even written here? And actually, that's one example, but that's one of many. And given that we've got lots and lots and lots of children who are not being responded to appropriately, not getting the care that they need, they are turning into adults, and these adults are now tripping over this language themselves and instantly recognizing that actually, why is this worded the way it is? So that's how I would answer that one.
Okay, thank you, Space. There's one here for Empower. This resonates with me so much. Why aren't we saying rape? And I know for years and years and years that I've been saying, if we use the term at risk or high risk when we talk about a young person. We're talking about something we can prevent, and quite often they're being significantly harmed at that current time. So yeah, why aren't we using the word rape, Lynette, is the question.
I'm not sure. I think, as has been highlighted by Romana and Afia today, I think it is sort of potentially a protective measure for our psychology sometimes, and we don't really want to acknowledge, you know, that we don't live in a just world society, that, you know, children who, for all purpose and intentions, you know, because you choose to go to a party where activities are inappropriate for your age group, that doesn't, you know, equate to, that means it's fair game for us to sexually assault you, rape you and commit crimes against you as a child. You know, and we need to acknowledge that just because children are in an experimental risk-taking phase, like biggest risk-taking and experimental phase of their life, that when they take risks and they experiment, that doesn't make it or excuse adults' criminal behaviours and the abuse of children as part of those circumstances. And often we don't recognise that through our language. And I think it's easier for us sometimes as professionals to sit there and say, you know, potentially I can see that somebody asked her whether they could put their penis in her mouth, and she politely declined, and they still continued to do that. And it's kind of like, actually, there's a seriousness to this. This is a crime that's been committed against a child. And we need to use legal language appropriately to show the urgency and the significance, really, of the abuse that is happening in our communities to our children who are vulnerable at their adolescent development stage, is my opinion. Sorry.
I think you touched there on the use of language and legislation, and I think you're quite right. You spoke about trafficking earlier, and if you can get a positive NRM on a young person, what you're doing is proving that a crime's been committed, and then you only have to prove who committed that crime. And it does make it alters the dynamics in court so massively that yeah, thank you, Lynette.
I think equally, Sheila, it changes the dynamics of the discussion and refocuses, yes, as Afia said in the meeting. And I think it was Space on their slide that said what we often see is this child travelled to. And actually, when you unpick the circumstances, they were, you know, they didn't catch the train, they didn't get on a bus, they were in a vehicle. So therefore, what we're saying, so in my meeting, I might turn around and say, OK, so what I'm hearing is this child was transported to another local authority area. And all of a sudden it creates a different urgency in that meeting, that actually, oh yes, this child was taken somewhere. This child did not pop itself in a car and drive up the motorway. That isn't what happened here. And what we need to better understand is what was the intentions of the movement of this child to that local authority area, and who were the adults that had those intentions to move that child and transport them. Given, you know, have they got PR? Are they a family member? Are they a professional that has a legitimate reason to be in the company of this child and transporting them somewhere else? And if not, you know, with all due respect, if that was my child, I would be very, very, very concerned about the intentions of any adult over the age of 18 who is in the company of my child and transporting them somewhere without my permission.
And of course, the NRM and the trafficking legislation, they don't have to be in a car, they can be moved, bus, train, whatever, walk, bicycle, as long as they're directed to go. We've got a question here. I don't know who wants to answer this one. Who do we need to question? Do we need to question whether young people themselves understand the word trauma, particularly when trying different interventions?
Sheila, I'm not sure whether that kind of builds on the previous question about being trauma responsive or trauma aware. I think often when I've spoken to professionals about whether they fully understand trauma, the answer is often no. And I think it's such a complex psychological process that even we as adults and professionals struggle to understand it and make sense of what's going on. And even for children, I think it's difficult to recognise that they are going through or suffering trauma. And often it takes them a lifelong piece of work to kind of process that abuse and exploitation. I think it's really important for us to attend to kind of language that children might use to describe their internal experience or their experience of distress, whatever that might be. In the article that we've recently published talking about narrative approaches to children who were exploited, the case study that we used was we had a girl with a significant history of complex trauma and exploitation. She talked about spaghetti in her head, and that was her trying to communicate the confusion, the overwhelming distress that she was experiencing, and we went with that language that she was using. Actually, we accepted it and we helped her understand what she was trying to communicate to us. And I think the foundations of going back to human rights-based practice is using the language that children are using to describe their kind of internal experience, whether that's physiological, emotional, or psychological. Then, as practitioners, we can support them in further exploring what that experience might be. Using the word trauma might not be appropriate for that child. And actually, they might deny that they've experienced trauma. So the foundations should be using their own language to help them make sense of their experience.
Just to add to what Romana's fed back, I would add being mindful that we know a child's chronological age, but there's also their psychological development age that we need to be mindful of when we are using language to describe their experiences. So again, going back to what Romana has said, using their specific language and us getting an understanding and a sense of what they mean by, for example, spaghetti in my head is what would be most useful.
Thank you, Afia. We've got another question here. Do you have advice pointers on what to include in court reports and PSRs to give weight to the NRM and what this ultimately means? I find it so disappointing when outcomes of these are simply ignored. We've had a case where the judge even remarked in his sentencing comments that the boy was 12 years old when it started and he clearly enjoyed it as here he is 7 years later, having progressed in the business model and doing it quite well.
I'm quite happy to answer that. I think that there's a really good example of where we as professionals need to challenge those things. Having spent quite a lot of time working in the courts and working alongside judges, their training schedule's really limited around this kind of thing. And I think what we need to do is raise the profile of it and make it mandatory that family court judges and family court workers should be getting the training and the understanding that forums like this are developing. I think that demonstrates to some extent the ignorance that still exists around us as professionals, and no criticism directly of that judge. But I think if that's a true example of something that's happened, it's our job as advocates on behalf of children and young people to start raising that and challenging it.
Excellent, thank you. There's somebody here talking about saying the MS guidance is a good starting point for court reports. So often the fact that under 18s cannot consent to their own exploitation, abuse, slavery is not understood by first responders or beyond. And I think certainly when I do presentations and you ask people to identify if they're a first responder to the NRM, very few know it. I first heard the use of trauma in the sense of injury used by a medic. The more we use language, the better children and others will understand it, which is very, very true, isn't it? There are so many comments that are saying the session has been brilliant. I think you have all done exceptionally well in your presentations. It's been really, really interesting to listen to all of you. You've got such wealth of knowledge in there to help people to move forward. And I think it's very clear that there's an awful lot of interest around this, and we want to try and keep some of this together and learn how you all implement this back in the field and how it changes the way we move forward, and this document will need reviewing. I think the more we use it, the more we'll know that there are other things that we need to add and update, and in order to do that we need to hear back from all of you so that we can ensure that we incorporate all of that. So it just really goes to me now to say thank you very much for everybody for attending. Romana, Afia, Steve, Space, for all of your hard work in getting this document together. To Birmingham Children's Trust, Lynette and Sheena, Shauna, Julie from Dorset Police, Joe from the Enthusiasm Trust, for doing presentations for us and bringing it all to life and making it real about how we can make changes. So thank you very, very much for attending today. There's been a lot of coming and going from people in the event, so apologies if the pinging for people arriving and leaving has disturbed some of you. But thank you ever so much for attending, and do keep in touch with us about your progress around making words count. Thank you.